Before we start the conversation, I actually want to very briefly have both of us introduce ourselves and kind of what it is that we do. And I think that helps to provide some perspective on where it is that we experience working around data privacy in our work. So Morgan, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Sounds great. Thanks, Leah. So first and foremost, just want to thank you, Leah, for joining me and having me today, and UserTesting for putting this on and inviting us to join. So I'm Morgan Mullen. I'm a user researcher at User Interviews. Before that, I worked on the Facebook app over at Meta. And before that, I worked at a user research agency measuring usability here in the Colorado area where I'm located. So my role is UX research. So I've been a researcher. I've ever since I started my professional career. First, I was in academia for a bit and then transitioned over into UX research. So data privacy has been top of mind for me since I started, especially, starting in academic research at Johns Hopkins, where we've got HIPAA laws and all of that good stuff. But anyway, so really excited to be here and be a part of this conversation. Data privacy is always top of mind with our customers here at User Interviews and also all of our participants. So excited to be here. Thanks for having me.
Great. Thank you so much for joining. And I'm really excited for our conversation today. And just a little bit about me. So I am also a researcher on both kind of that academic side as well as in the real applied corporate setting as well. And I've been in the industry for, over 20 years. So that definitely shows my age a little bit, really thinking about a wide variety of different settings. So everything from working in pharmaceutical, financial services industries, and as well, I'm teaching at the University of Michigan, so have a lot of experience working in the world of IRBs and data privacy in that setting as well. So really looking forward to the conversation too.
Yeah, lots of industries you mentioned there where data security and privacy has been top of mind for a long time, maybe even longer than sort of, other industries.
Very, very definitely the case. Yes. So actually, what I wanted to start with is really kind of thinking about where it is that we are now around data privacy, because I think that with the pandemic, we've seen, not that data privacy wasn't important before the pandemic, but it's even more important now. So I just wanted to get a sense for your thoughts around why data privacy is so critical now.
Yeah. So great question. And I do think the pandemic does play a role. I mean, even before the pandemic, we saw all of this sort of mounting pressure, I think, from just people in public outcry about data privacy and protection, with a lot of leaks and people actually kind of figuring out more what their data was being used for, with various apps and everything they use closely day to day. So I think there was already this mounting pressure building, and we saw that sort of, surface through different laws passing. I think, GDPR, like in the EU, for an example. So we had this sort of building pressure. But I think, as like with the pandemic, what I think happened more so is we were shifting to being online. Everything was shifting to be online. And then when the pandemic happened, even more things moved online. So that meant more of our information, more of our data in all sorts of different, websites, applications, what have you. And so I think as more things shifted online and there's already sort of this mounting outcry, people are, I think, just they've lost a lot of trust in a lot of industries and a lot of different larger tech companies and whatnot. And I think what this is pushing towards is people just want to have a little bit more control over their data and make sure it is being handled appropriately. And I think just shifting more things online has further pushed that, on top of just mental exhaustion from the last few years and maybe feelings of frustration on top of that as well. But would love to hear sort of what you're seeing on your end too, Leah.
Yeah, I think it's fascinating because kind of in preparing for today's conversation, I was going back and just trying to really pin these. So when did Cambridge Analytica happen? And what was that? And, that was back in 2017. And I think, just as a brief reminder, that was essentially a situation where a lot of psychographic data was collected about people directly, but also indirectly. So what happened was that people were not able to opt in. And I think that, people have also become very aware of misuse of their data because of actually being exposed to credit card fraud. So it's not something that is abstract for them. It's something where, people who've had the experience of actually having their credit card data stolen, um, are understandably a lot more concerned about their data privacy. And so I think it's not just like an emotional feeling. It actually is a practical, like, I have to transact, therefore my expectation of there being a greater focus on data security is even higher. However, what does this mean in a setting where you're really trying to understand the user experience?
Yeah, it's challenging, right? Because I think we have to take a step back and sort of think about like what are user researchers trying to do? What are data analysts in product teams trying to do, right? We look at different data so that we can see, people's behaviors. What are people using? What features are they using on a website, right? And identify, what types of changes can we make in the product to make it better? Like, where are the areas we need to focus on? And who are the types of users we need to talk to, or people we need to talk to figure out how we make a product better, right? So I think that's like taking a step back. That's how we use this data, right? And it's a positive message there, right? We're trying to use it for good. But I think what this means for research is we have to step back and think about maybe we have not where we have dropped the ball with communicating that to users, customers, clients effectively, right? I think it means, I think we're going to dive into this a little bit more, but not only the importance of opt-in research, but also thinking about how do we clearly communicate what data we're collecting, when and why. Is there a way to sort of give more user control to that and a little bit more flexibility there? I think historically, maybe where we've gone a little wrong with that is, as a wider industry, is what I mean by this. I think there's been a lot of implied consent before, right? Like, you think of those really long terms that are like 7 to 30 pages. It's in like really teeny tiny font, and it's written in a lot of jargon that maybe, a lot of other folks who aren't in, legal or outside of the industry may not understand. And your only options are sort of to just agree to all of these terms that maybe you didn't fully get to read or understand. And if you don't agree with them, you just can't use the product, right? It's just sort of like opt out, right? And I think that's also sort of implied consent versus informed consent. I think that's one area maybe where historically things haven't gone so well, and where we need to reflect on and do better. The other area is, I think I was talking to our legal director, Amy Halpert, about this, and she brought up a good point. And I'm going to term it as like FOMO to not having enough data. I think there's a lot of FOMO within research teams, product teams of we've got to collect as much data as possible, because even though we're only looking at these 3 points right now, maybe we need to go back and look at these other data points, or answer, questions around these behaviors. And so that sort of led to this, let's collect as much as possible and maybe hold on to data longer. And when you do that, that's not really enough of a reason to collect more data, right? Like, if there aren't questions at hand directly related to that data, and if you're keeping data for a long period of time and keeping more data, you're just sort of increasing the risks for everybody, yourself as a researcher, yourself as a company, and also for the people who you're collecting data about, right?
Mhm.
So I think it's taking a step back and looking at those areas maybe where we as user researchers or product teams or companies have maybe dropped the ball, and reflecting on how we can improve upon that. But Leah, I know this has been top of mind for you a lot recently, so I'd love to hear your thoughts
Yeah.
on this.
It's interesting because I always say, like, in a perfect world, you would have 3 data streams. You would have behavioral data that gives you an understanding what's actually happening around the stuff that you care about, but I think most importantly, at a cadence that's actionable for you. And I think what happens too frequently is that we're looking at data at a cadence that is either too aggressive because we can't actually react as much as we would like to, um, or we are collecting too much and it ends up just being like clutter, like it's not important anymore. Then you have attitudinal data, which is really around intent and expectations and perception, and also about whether people are feeling like satisfied. And that's important too. It's also really volatile. And yeah, it's great to have like maybe a rolling 13 months, but because the greater macroeconomic environment and just what's happening in the world changes so much, keeping that data around for a really long time is just not as helpful. And then you also have that empathic data, which you can use both in I think, a diagnostic and a prescriptive way. And that can help to inform those other data streams, right? Or also work in a way where you can use it in a complementary fashion too. So, my personal opinion of it is that you do really need to be very careful about what it is that you're collecting, and also understanding that you have a really good idea of how you're going to use that, how you're going to de-identify specific data points, capture that information, and then store it in a way that ensures that it's accessible to a limited number of people, and that after a certain time period, you're going to archive it and not have it be accessible. And I mean, we see standards being used in many different settings around ensuring that you're de-risking the management of data. Um, I, you know, I really do think that your point around implied consent and informed consent is so critical. And that's something that um, we really need to be considering around being more thoughtful around how it is we gather feedback from people. So I'm curious, like, how do you in your work ensure that you're collecting or creating an environment where informed consent is the norm?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think really in my work, it's always around making sure that our informed consent forms are very clear and understandable to the audience we're working with, right? One of our marketing partners actually posed this great question the other day. It's like, when it comes to informed consent, is there some sort of like friction between sort of like the legal language that needs to be in there and like doing good user research? If there is, does there have to be? And I think in talking with our legal director, it sounds like a lot of times there's just not a lot of good playbooks out there for how to build strong informed consent forms or informed consents in general.
Mm.
There's all these privacy laws, but they don't necessarily give you sort of the, hey, you need to do these things. This is what your form should look like. But the spirit of informed consent is the person who's reading it needs to comprehend what you're telling them, and know what they're agreeing to or what they're not agreeing to, right? And so I think in my work, what we've tried to do here in previous roles is have very clear consent forms that are breaking down in everyday language, avoiding jargon. Hey, this is what we're going to be doing. This is why we're going to be doing this, and what we're going to be doing with your data. And then also, here's how we're going to store and protect it. And I think that's an area where we need to be like, we as a whole, as an industry, need to be clear, just telling people like, hey, here's how we're going to manage and control and protect your data. And here's how long we're going to hang on to it, as to what you said. So I think it's having those clear, informed consents. I think it's anytime you're with a participant face-to-face, you remind them of that. You make sure there's no questions. That was very, very critical in one of my first roles, where I was working with children and teachers and parents and whatnot, just making sure everybody understand as they were signing their forms what they're agreeing to. And I think, just I'll say, we at User Interviews, we serve a lot of different customers who use our tools, and privacy, PII, all that stuff is really top of mind for them. And so, I'd be curious to continue discussing with my internal team, like, how can we sort of support folks in building these practices and bringing their own practices to their research as well. So I think it's clear, informed consent, and also, clearly communicating on your company website, hey, here's when you agree to our terms and when you sign up, here's what we're tracking. Like, here are the things we're using. This is why we're doing it, right? Like, can we have clear things like that so that when people are using just your product and maybe they're not even participating in a set research study, they're clearly understanding and informed in terms of what is being tracked and why. So I'd say those are the couple of points I would bring up. Curious to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I think I 100% agree with all the points that you've made. And I would also add, I think about the context in which research is being done as well, because you actually need to be picking areas that, one, matter, and that, two, are about helping people and not hurting them.
Yeah.
And I've been doing a lot of reading and rereading of the UXPA codes, like around ethical research. And I just think they're such a simple way of speaking to just the general setup of how to do high quality research with and alongside people. And I think you really have to think about it in that way. And then I think the second piece, and I think about it as you should be user testing your privacy policies. And rather than asking people directly, do you understand it? And this is something that's very resonant for me because we frequently do this. Ask people, do you understand? And most of the time people are going to self-report, of course they understand, because they don't want to appear that they don't, right? Social desirability there. And instead, what you should be doing is testing what are people understanding of what it is that you're describing to them in terms of how their data is going to be collected, used, and destroyed later on too.
Yeah. I think it's part of it too is, taking a step back, and this is a conversation that has to happen cross-functionally within your company or within your team, right? All players should be at the table here. And I totally agree, like, testing, sort of understanding. I also think, like, as a whole, as sort of like user research or best practices across our industry, is there a way to sort of take a step back and think about, with the data we're collecting and why, like, can we give flexibility to people in what they do and don't want to opt into, right? Like, would people sort of prefer something that's a bit more flexible where they can, pick and choose? Maybe they can pick sort of a time frame, right? I do wonder if there's a way to sort of, as teams, come together and think about, what do we really need and why? How long do we actually need it? And what does that mean on the user side? Is there any way we can give, like, even more control and still, feel like we have enough data to work from and that we're still able to answer, tough questions around our product and inform our product direction?
Yeah. Well, I guess, that really gets to the point. Do you need all the data all the time? And how do we help to advocate for a more conservative approach to collecting data?
Yeah, so great question. I think, this is sparking an idea for me, and it's not necessarily like an answer right now, but I'd be curious to see, and there may be some research out there already, like, as you mentioned, in sort of testing your users, like, can we get preferences from our users and figure out sort of where they're at, what they're thinking, what their attitudes are on this, what would be their sort of dream scenario, or what we call sort of like unicorn wishes, what would be the ideal? I wonder if, having that data and actually having that point of view from your actual customers, clients, users, and then bringing that back to your teams is a way to sort of help show the impact we can have here. And I think also, for me, the big point to drive home here is, think about any sort of experience you've had with a business. The best businesses you've interacted with have probably been ones that had really stellar customer service. They cared about you, they were empathetic, they responded to your need, they supported you, right? They put you first. And I think, we are user researchers. And even if you're not a user researcher, most likely you may be working for a company or for a product that serves, customers or users in some way, right? And so I think just reminding ourselves that we are serving this group and we need to make sure we're responding to their needs, respecting sort of their desires, and also part of that means sort of respecting their data privacy and getting their thoughts on that.
Yeah, and I think that's a very difficult balance to find,
Yes.
mostly because people, I won't say are lazy necessarily, but don't want to invest a lot of time in, capturing, storing, responding to questions about how to set up an account.
Yeah.
And, we see design patterns arising from, essentially data mining using AI, or machine learning behaviors, and being able to apply certain strategies given some of those known behaviors, usually at that more aggregate level, right? Sometimes it's very, like, I think about Netflix here, for example, which has a lot of recommendation
Yeah.
engines that are built on both individual behaviors as well as informed by some of those greater behaviors. um, Versus, some of the micro targeting of ads, right, that are really based on more aggregate
Right.
sorts of data. And it's really interesting because I think many people have the assumption, especially the older they are, that this information is being used to create experiences. Some people feel more or less squeamish about it.
Right.
So there's trade-offs.
Absolutely. And also, we'll add, and I know this is top of mind for you too, Leah, but it also differs by, there's global differences there too, right? There's, I don't want to say for certain, but I know there's, certain countries where people as a whole feel more comfortable with data tracking, and then other countries where as a whole people are a little bit more reluctant about it. So I think, just adding that too, and in addition to the other notes around sort of like, sometimes there can be like age differences and perceptions around that as well.
Wow. And I think you're spot on because in some countries, it's not just a matter of whether people prefer it, it's a matter of personal safety.
Yes. Yep.
So, when for instance, yes, I have been reading sections of GDPR recently just because of research that we've been doing at UserTesting, really understanding the genesis of a lot of the guidelines that they have come up with has been really around protecting the rights of minority communities and people with disabilities. And so it's, the protection of private information, especially at an individual level, is also about ensuring that everybody has equality of access to products and services and programming. And so there's a real life impact to collecting that information.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Completely agree.
But, I actually wanted to shift gears a little bit and actually talk a little bit about we've been seeing a lot of talk and I think action around democratizing research and who has access to both doing, you can call it insights collection because it may not always rise to the level of being research, and who has access to the data. And I'm curious kind of how you're navigating that democratization shift and, how you manage that access to data.
Great, great question. And I think this is something where when we talk about sort of cross-functional, team conversations needing to be a part of this, like this is absolutely critical here, right? I think how we approach it. We're big fans of democratizing research here at User Interviews. I think this is where people who are researchers by trade or people who are reops folks, this is like big plug for reops folks, they have a huge role to play here.
Yeah.
This is where they need to step in and guide their cross-functional partners across their product teams here. We're close to it. We're close to different processes around sort of informed consent and data privacy and just ethics when it comes to research. And so I think working with your product managers, your designers, whoever is part of this process of doing research and making sure that they understand the importance of this and they have, examples of how you've approached this as a researcher or as a reops person, within your team. So I think guiding, making sure people are clear about how this is actually used, having those, strong like research playbooks or templates, examples that people can fall back on. I think that's a really, really key part of, helping, other partners do research effectively. So that's one thing I will say is just like have those conversations, make sure, as people are doing research that they're aware of just like the importance of it, and also have those clear cut examples.
Yeah, I think that creating process is really critical. I think that helps you to get around some of the challenges that might be um, very much around where the data is stored and housed and how long, and that process piece, and having a reops person there who can ensure that those standards are maintained across time and across the team, and that there's ongoing training
Yes.
is so critical. It's really critical. And I think there's a related conversation about like repositories and what gets in there and how long you keep that information and what's evergreen versus,
Yep.
something that should be tossed after a bit.
Yeah, I was just listening to the Reops podcast. Great podcast, by the way, for folks in the field. And I can't remember the name of the guest, but this was actually a conversation they recently had around Reops and how it's so important to have that person who there's the clear process around what you're saying, like what data is being collected from who, for how long, what are just having that single source of truth for the process and making sure folks are aware of that who are participating in the research. So I think this is why having, dedicated research ops folks is such a strong part and should be, such a critical part to product teams moving ahead.
Absolutely. I wish I mean, I'm seeing more people in this function actually in my work, but we could definitely use more.
Oh yeah. Completely agree.
So finally, I think I wanted to close with a question around what are some of the alternatives that you see people being able to use instead of using big data that, where we've got implied consent? What are some of the strategies that we could be using instead?
Yeah, I think this is a good question to reflect on. And I've been thinking about this a lot from the perspective of what types of methodologies as researchers maybe can we leverage to, get data in different ways. Is there a way maybe we can build in, consents where we're asking folks, hey, can we track certain things for just a certain period of time? And they're aware of exactly what they're doing and just for a certain length of time rather than sort of sharing indefinitely, right? Is that a potential option we can go? I think more specifically to UX research, can we leverage diary studies or unmoderated testing, with screen sharing? A lot of tools are getting a lot better at doing this, right? Or more, as we sort of, exit from the pandemic and people are feeling more comfortable, can we leverage more observational style methods, right? I think, the con here is these methods take a little bit longer, right? They're more involved. They do take a longer period of time. But at the end of the day, are we, by leveraging these methods, are we, one, providing a better user customer experience around data? And two, maybe are we getting more rich information and digging into more of the whys maybe behind the actions and the behaviors and the data, right? So I think maybe there is an opportunity for us as researchers to advocate for some of these other methodologies and push our teams to sort of allow for the time and space to dig into these other options that where some users may feel more comfortable in terms of their data being shared in these settings.
Yeah, and I always, I 100% agree with you on all of the other observational methods, but I always also remind myself past performance doesn't always indicate future behavior, right?
Right.
And so, like sometimes that behavioral data, that attitudinal data is in the past. And when things change quickly, you need to be able to pivot. And so to a certain extent, that requires you to do some of that observational testing because it enables you to put things in front of people that they aren't going to encounter in a real life setting.
Yep, exactly.
Yeah. So, we've just reached the end of time. Thank you so much for your time today, Morgan. This has been a really great conversation about a topic that I'm really passionate about.